Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 336. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about sidewalk cafes, Roman ruins, and minarets as we go to Serbia and Kosovo. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have three news stories for you. In the first one, we learned that when you're passing through security, you should probably keep your wits about you. A man with a metal hip caused the Brisbane airport to shut down because after they discovered that he had a metal hip, he wandered off. And as they were preparing to screen him, they discovered that they didn't know where he was and they had to empty everyone out from the airport. So please pay attention. And then we've talked previously on the last episode we did on India about going to the tiger parks. That may no longer be possible as an Indian top court has banned tourism in tiger reserves across India in an aim to protect the endangered big cats. So if you're planning on doing that, you might want to double check before you go. Speaking of double checking before you go, cruisers are suing over a stormy sailing across the Atlantic. Now, that sounds a little ridiculous, but it depends a little bit on how much the cruise line knew ahead of time because they sailed into heavy seas. This is the classic International Cruises 580-passenger Athena, and the seas were so heavy that more than a dozen passengers were injured, and one passenger died after falling down a flight of stairs. For links to all three of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome back to the show Shawn Farris, coming to us from Utah, and come to talk to us about some of the Balkans, Serbia, and Kosovo. Shawn, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Chris.
And before we get started, I should say you've been on the show twice, and I had actually forgotten that. I was thinking once. Once talking about the Guangxi region of China, and the other time talking about Transylvania in Romania.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, before we get started about the trip that you did in Serbia and Kosovo, which was part of a larger trip to the Balkans, you have a story about something that happened in Montenegro.
Yeah, this is a fun story. I was in Budva, Montenegro as part of this trip to the Balkans, and I met some people in a cafe. We were talking about travel and different travel sites, and I mentioned the Amateur Traveler. One of the ladies perked up and she said, "Oh, I've been listening to those episodes on my iTunes." And I mentioned that I had been on before, and she said, "Which episodes?" And I said, "Transylvania." And she goes, "Oh, weren't you the one also on China too?" And she actually recognized who I was by the podcast.
And just makes my day. And was able to quote part of the podcast, I think was the punchline you left off that you told me.
And she did. And she remembered certain things like the China episode of the lady spamming me as I walked up the hill.
Oh, gosh, yes. Excellent. Well, we'll refer people back to those episodes to hear what they're missing if they don't know what we're talking about. But why Serbia and Kosovo?
Primarily, it was just one of those trips I wanted to plan and try to do. I thought seeing them all in a row would be interesting to see the cultures back to back. And I have a personal travel goal to be in more countries than I am old. And so this trip, actually, I was able to put passport stamp number 60 on my passport.
And which puts you ahead, we should point out. More countries than years of age.
I'm now 15 countries ahead of my age.
There you go. And we should clarify one thing. We talk about Serbia and Kosovo, and there's a little confusion here because you either went to one country or two.
Well, depends on which person you ask. According to Serbia, it's all the same country. In fact, recently the president of Serbia made a news announcement that he didn't understand why the big deal about Kosovo, because Kosovo was part of Serbia still. However, the UN and about 80 other different countries recognize Kosovo as the Republic of Kosovo, a separate country.
Excellent. So what is your itinerary that you would recommend to people?
Well, one of the interesting things about Kosovo, because of the disputed borders, and the UN troops are still there, they're protecting the borders. And I had read an article that said, if you're going to head to Serbia also, you want to visit Serbia first and then Kosovo, and not the reverse, because the Serbia will not recognize, may not recognize the passport stamp entering Kosovo, may cross it off and declare you an illegal alien.
Oh, gosh. All right.
So, in order to avoid that problem, I suggest first going into Serbia like I did, and then I went into Macedonia, entered Kosovo from the North Macedonia into the southern region of Kosovo, and then exited through Albania.
Okay. Now, neither of these is a very big country, but Kosovo is much smaller.
Yeah, Kosovo is tiny. I think it's approximately half the size of New Jersey, 60, 70 miles across by 60, 70 miles north to south.
And then, so you started in Serbia. Where did you go there, and what did you see?
First went to Belgrade, to the capital.
Mm-hmm.
What a fun, vibrant city. Then after Belgrade, and we can talk more detail about these, but then went to Novi Sad for a day trip, and then traveled down to a place called Niš, which is kind of a southern central city. That was on my way down into Macedonia.
And now let's go back in a little more detail. So Belgrade, first of all. Belgrade? Sorry, I've been saying that wrong, it sounds like.
Beograd, Belgrade, depends on which language you're speaking. That's the pronunciation, or the way that it's even spelled. Really a fun old city. It has a huge fortress in the middle of town. In fact, I rented an apartment just right across the street from this fortress, and it's been a fortress for 2,300 years.
Oh my, okay.
One of the people I was talking to over at the museum area said that there's been over 110 to 120 different battles fought over that site.
Hmm.
When you locate yourself on prime real estate, I guess you attract conquerors.
Well, and we're talking about an area that, especially from the 1400s on, was a real fault line there between the Christian and Islam.
Exactly.
The balkanization of that area, of course.
And it still does have, especially in the southern regions, Niš and also into Kosovo, a very Ottoman feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
And Belgrade, just one of those Eastern European cities with a lively pedestrian cafe type of culture, very friendly people. Because Serbia has kind of been in the news over the last couple of decades of being war-torn and problematic, I didn't know exactly what to expect, especially when the U.S. kind of sponsored a 78-day bombing campaign of their city. Didn't know if there was still some animosity over there.
But you did not run into any.
In fact, I ran into the exact opposite. I ran into people who just, when they heard that I was an American, they were friendly. They were more than willing to help. I arrived at the airport, asked some directions from he turned out to be a geophysicist. And as soon as I mentioned America, he just lit up and told me about his trip in the 70s to the U.S. and followed me on the bus, made sure I got to the apartment, gave me his business card with his cell phone number. If you have any questions or problems, you call me and my son or I will take care of you. Just really extremely friendly people.
Oh, my. Okay.
Linguistically, language, very easy to get around in Serbia. English is predominantly spoken. It helps if you read Cyrillic, if you go off the tourist track. But if you don't, probably anybody under the age of 40 speaks English very well. Okay.
And Cyrillic is not uncomprehensible. There's a few tricks to it, knowing that your pi is a p and things like that.
Exactly. And what's that backward order and how do you say it?
Exactly.
But with the English spoken there widely, it's very easy to get around. In fact, I would have no concerns if you were English only speaking to get around Serbia.
And I'm assuming you didn't speak a lot of Serbo-Croatian.
Yeah, I have a little college background in Russian.
Okay.
And so the Russian translates pretty easily to the Serbian.
Mm-hmm. So please and thank you, for instance, are fairly close, as I recall.
Yeah, and good day and how are you, that type of, but it almost was not absolutely needed to know any Serbian.
Okay.
And then what's interesting about some of the other sites of Belgrade, you go to the Aeronautical Museum or the Military Museum, and they have pieces of the American stealth fighter and the F-16 that they shot down, which they're very proud about.
Okay.
In fact, one of the Serbian generals apparently is quoted as saying, "The Americans called the American stealth fighter as invisible, we just called it harder to see." As I visited with people there, I expected to maybe run into some animosity over the bombings, and there was none. One person mentioned to me, they said, well, we're smart enough to be able to know the difference between American politics and American citizens.
So you mentioned the cafe culture and the fortress at the top of the hill, which I assume you toured.
I did, yeah.
Okay. And did you want to say more about that? Is there a museum up there or just a great view? Or
they have the military museum. That's where the remnant F-16 is. And out in the airport, there's an aeronautical museum. There is a huge Orthodox church that apparently was started in about 1935, halted by Hitler, and then continued to be built. But it's absolutely massive. In fact, it's either the largest or one of the largest Serbian Orthodox churches in the world.
Interesting. Okay.
And then you have Nikola Tesla Museum, dedicated to the Serbian-born inventor of alternate current.
Indeed.
And they're very proud of him.
And numerous other things, but we certainly know him for, well, or should know him for alternate current since we use that on a daily basis.
We do, yeah. In fact, apparently he worked for Watson at one time and then broke away and started a competing business against him. Or no, it was Edison.
We worked for Edison, yeah.
And then after Belgrade, one of the funnest cities, I think, in Serbia was Niš. Spelled N-I-S in English, but it's actually with an S-H sound to the end of it. And this was the birthplace of Constantine the Great.
Oh, okay. All right, going back a little ways here. Back to the 300s.
Back to the 300s, exactly. And kind of the start of the legalization of Christianity around that area of the world.
Interesting.
And they're very proud of him being originally from there.
Which also points out that this was part of the Roman Empire way back in that time, because he wasn't born outside. Okay.
And, you know, there's a lot of different ruins that I had never heard about. The old Niš fortress was actually a Roman camp centuries ago, and then just the Byzantine built upon it, and the Ottomans built upon it, and it's just kind of this layer upon layer of civilization. So
this city is at least 2,000 years old then.
Oh, yes. A lot of this region, they've dug up findings and are continuing to find new archaeological digs. We'll talk about Kosovo. There's a little bronze statue called the Runner of Prizren, which I think is on display in the London Museum or one of the British museums. It dates back to 500 BC, apparently from Sparta.
Okay, interesting. So from the Bronze Age.
Exactly.
Huh, interesting.
But Niš and Belgrade and Novi Sad are definitely worth visits, all three of them. It's easy to get around. I would suggest bus travel versus train travel. Train travel tends to be slightly less expensive, but twice as long to get around. And the buses are just easy to get around the country and very inexpensive.
I'm going to correct myself. I put 500 in the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age ended about 700 years before that. So about that. That would be the Iron Age, but I'm trying to do these things sometimes off the top of my head, and about 100 years before that in Europe.
There you go. But I mean, it's kind of fascinating, especially for the West, that we don't know much about these archaeological sites, and they're really fun to visit.
Are they open to the public, I assume, then, and there's a minimal admission, or?
Admission prices in all of these countries is very inexpensive.
Okay.
Even less so as you get into Kosovo.
And so they're still doing actual work at the dig site?
There's different archaeological digs going around, especially in that Niš area.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the benefits of this region is just the friendliness of the people.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, kind of segueing into that, when I went into Kosovo, I again didn't know what to expect. Arrived in Prizren, kind of was on my way to find my hotel from the bus station. I stopped off at a cafe because, of course, when you smell kebabs cooking, you got to stop.
Well, of course.
In my broken, and predominantly in Kosovo, although it used to be a region of Serbia, Albanian is the predominant language there, and the secondary language is German.
Oh, interesting. That surprises me. Okay.
Kind of surprising me, but somebody told me that they used to send a lot of people over to Germany as laborers and workers, and they would send money back into the country to their family.
Okay.
And that became kind of the predominant secondary language to be used. Anyway, I was eating at this cafe, and then I paid the waiter, and I asked directions to my place I was staying. After he gave me directions, he asked me in German if I was German. I said, no, I'm not German. He said, are you Italian? I said, I'm not Italian. I said, I'm American. And he just lit up. Wow, you're American? This is incredible. Welcome. Thank you for coming, which I thought was a very nice greeting. And then he reaches in and takes out the money I paid for my meal, lays it back on the table, and says, this meal is on the house. It's free.
This was in Kosovo.
This is in Kosovo.
Okay.
I was kind of surprised by that. I'm happy to pay for my meal. No, this is on us. We appreciate you being here. Thank you for coming. And then the owner comes over, and are you really American? Yeah, I'm really American. Well, this table over here, these gentlemen would like to buy you a free Albanian dessert. Okay. And these gentlemen wave for me and then smile at me. And then this other table, they're taking cell phone pictures of me. It was just kind of the welcome I didn't expect. So after I finished dessert, I shook hands with everybody. I left. And I know that I'm getting close to the old town where I'm staying. And I asked this 13-year-old schoolboy, he was in a school uniform walking back from school. And I asked him in my broken Albanian if this was the correct way to the Mother Teresa Square. And he indicated that it was and asked me if I was German, because that's kind of the fallback language. I said, no, I'm not German, I'm American. He lit up again. He grabbed hold of my bags and wanted to help me take me to my hotel. And then he sees some of his friends and he waves them over and introduces me to them because I'm an American. And was just happy to just help me with my baggage as he go to the hotel. So I thought that was kind of a fun welcome. So I gave him some little candy bars I had with me, and I walked into the hotel that I was staying, and I tell them in, again, my broken Albanian, I have a reservation under my name, and they lit up. You're the American. Yes, I am. And the owners come down.
The word had already gotten there before you. Okay.
And they didn't speak any English, but they wanted to speak to me in German. And do I understand any German? And my German's not too bad for conversational German. And he says, we've fixed you up in the best room that we have, and we're welcome to have you here. And when I left early, a few days later, when I left Prizren to go into Albania, his wife got up at 5:30 that morning to make me breakfast and to send me off with this bag of bread and bananas because she thought I might be hungry on the road over there. And then I went over to a shop, and I found a shirt that I liked, and so I bought this shirt. And I'm talking to the owner in my broken German again, and he finds out that I'm an American. He lights up, and he reaches under the countertop and pulls out a little flag stand, one of those little, like, 4x2 flags, those little mini flags that we have.
Sure, yeah.
And there's a Kosovo flag displayed with an American flag. He didn't know I was coming, but yet he has this underneath his countertop and brings this out, and he's just happy to talk to me. And then as part of the conversation, I mentioned I was traveling around and I enjoyed collecting money and banknotes. He sends his son off to grab an envelope, comes back, pulls out this 100-year-old Albanian banknote and gives it to me as a welcome to Kosovo present.
Oh, my goodness.
And then he asked me if I can stick around for just a few minutes while his son goes and gets his family so they can all meet me. I had a long conversation with him, and the citizens of Kosovo are just very appreciative of the UN and the U.S. and welcome you with open arms. They just think it's just fantastic that you're traveling there.
Interesting. I'm going to take us back a little bit because we magically jumped across the border there. We were in Mish. And you were telling us a little bit about Serbia, so we're going to go back to that for a second, then we'll get back to Kosovo in just a few minutes here.
Sure.
You had 3 places that you had mentioned in Serbia, and we've talked about 2 of them. And Mish, we've talked about the people. We haven't talked about so much. We've talked about the archaeological digs there. Anything else you would recommend in that particular region?
Yeah, there's an interesting tower. It's called Cele Kula, C-E-L-E. The next word is K-U-L-A. It translates as the Skull Tower. Well, apparently when the Turks were trying to dissuade people from fighting against the Ottoman Empire, they decided to take the captives of the Serbs that they had conquered, and they decapitated them and put their skin skulls and made this mosaic out of this tower with these embedded skulls in this tower. And when it was built, apparently there was 952 skulls embedded into this thing as kind of a warning, don't go against the Ottoman Empire.
Mm.
So it's kind of a gruesome sight, but it definitely is a historical memory of historical deterrence, I guess you may call it.
Hmm.
There's a concentration camp there, if you're interested in World War II history. It's called the Red Cross concentration camp. I think the number is close to 30,000 Jews and Roma who were paraded through there, and 12 to 15,000 of them were killed within the concentration camp before it was liberated by the Yugoslav partisans in 1944.
In 44.
Uh-huh. We talked a little bit about this, but because of Constantine the Great and the predominance of Roman culture there, you have all these mosaic and Roman bathrooms that have been found and parts of the remnants of the imperial palace, and that's kind of fun to wander and see those fairly unknown ruins, quite extensive in the area.
Was there one that stood out for you that you went to?
The area just outside is old historical road out of Niš, known as the Imperial Roman Palace, and that was worthwhile to a visit.
Excellent. And does that cover Niš? Should we move on? You mentioned 3 places in Serbia.
Yeah, Novi Sad.
Okay.
Novisad. If you left early in the morning from Belgrade, you could definitely see Novi Sad in a few hours. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hours by bus. It's an easy day trip from Belgrade. But it has the big fortress that sits on the Danube River. There's some churches and some museums there. There's an old preserved castle just north of Novi Sad. And it's just one of those towns that is historically very similar to Belgrade, but has a smaller town feel to it. And I think it's fun to see that similarities and contrast between the capital city and Novi Sad.
Okay.
I'd recommend to visit us in Novi Sad. I think it's an easy day trip from Belgrade.
Excellent. And just getting back just a little bit to the Roman history, I was just looking up and I was trying to remember that I think this was Illyria, and not just Constantine, but actually a number of the later Roman emperors came from that region.
Yes. And then just across the border in Macedonia, you have the proclaimed birthplace of Alexander the Great.
Sure. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, do we want to move on then into Kosovo?
Well, sure. Yeah.
So you took a circuitous route to Kosovo.
I did, and that was because of that article that I had read that said because that northern border served with Serbia is still disputed territory or still contested by the Serbians hotly, that it's recommended not to cross the border there.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a better idea to cross through the southern borders. And it's really not that far out of the way. In fact, you can combine it a trip to northern Macedonia, which is and add a country to your list for those of us counting countries.
And now, what is your minimum amount of time you have to spend in the country to count it?
Well, I think you have to spend at least a full day.
Okay.
Night and a day.
There are different people have different rules. I think most people would not count an airport stop, but if you get out of the airport and had a meal, that's some people's definition there. So
I think if you exit and got a passport stamp and you at least saw something or ate something of the culture, I think you're good to go there. All this region, both Serbia and Kosovo, especially Serbia, the cuisine is delicious food. It kind of has a mixture of Greek, Turkish, and Italian.
Oh, an Italian. Okay. That I would not expect.
And so the same place you have pastas and pizzas being served at the same place that you have kebabs next door, and then you have this Turkish food that's being served just down the street. And it's just really fun cuisine-wise and very inexpensive.
Mm-hmm. And I would guess that this region, not just the food, but the lodging was also relatively inexpensive.
Yeah.
If for nothing else, from the way you're being greeted. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, I stayed in kind of an established hotel in Kosovo, but in Serbia, in Belgrade, I rented an apartment off a website, and it turned out to be this great one-bedroom apartment right across the street from the historical fortress park. And I think I paid close to $30 a night for the apartment.
Okay. And did you use a local website, or did you use one of the major apartment rental sites?
I used the site called Airbnb.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And I thought that it worked out just great. Found great places, mostly in residential neighborhoods. You could buy breakfast, bring it back to your apartment.
Mm-hmm.
So it saved on both your lodging costs and also your food costs.
Excellent. Yeah, and Airbnb can be used also to rent just a room sometimes, depending on what the person who is providing the lodging is trying to do.
They can. In fact, it's everything from somebody's couch to a spare bedroom to your own apartment to an entire house.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually an option for those people who are not aware of that brand in the U.S. as well.
It is. I actually highly recommend it. I think it was my first time using Airbnb, and I was very rewarded for those days.
And I love the apartment stays. We've done that a couple different times, and it makes you a little more of a local. I think
It
it's
does. Yeah.
a more interesting experience.
You shop in the local supermarket. You
Yeah.
shop at the local bakery. I think it enhances the experience.
Excellent. Kosovo.
Kosovo. Interesting, the openness of the people. They do a head bumping thing that's kind of interesting. You see people greet each other and they kind of bump the sides of their foreheads as they shake each other's hands. And that's just kind of this open sight of how friendly Kosovo Albanian, the ethnic Albanians are in that region. And people that are very welcoming of other cultures. Another fun story is this was in Kosovo. I stopped to get my shoe shined. I was eating at a local restaurant and I was watching the shoe shine, and they had this elaborate shoe shine box. And so I stopped to get my shoe shined by him. Of course, I don't speak in Albanian or Turkish, but he broke into German and then broke into English. He was probably in his 20s. He was able to converse fairly well in 4 different languages. And I made a comment of this shoe shine box that he had, and he just lit up and said, "It's my grandfather's profession that I've inherited."
And I'm going to picture this is inlaid with metal.
Yes.
And has carvings or something on the outside, and it's almost a V shape.
Yes, exactly. It's all hammered. It's decorative. I have never seen anybody shine shoes as well as he did. And he found a little scuff mark that leather had come off, and he filed it down and put 3 different polishes on it. It was interesting to have him be so proud of that profession of being a shoe shine man. It was just refreshing to see somebody who had accepted their lot in life and was very content about it.
And I was describing a shoe shine box I saw in Istanbul, so you can see the influence in the region. So, okay.
Yeah, it has that Ottoman Turkish type of influence there.
Well, and Kosovo, of course, would be a predominantly Islamic country.
Yes.
Versus Serbia, which is obviously, as you mentioned, Orthodox.
Being there, you see all the minarets in the town and the calls to prayer. It's definitely a cultural experience for Westerners if they're unfamiliar with the Islamic Muslim culture. It's to be in amongst that many mosques and that culture that there is predominant there.
Well, and one of the pictures that you sent actually has been on the Amateur Traveler before, and I don't know what town I'm in Kosovo.
It's Prizren.
Yeah. I'm not going to try and pronounce these.
Prizren. Prizren.
Okay.
Of the cities, of the places I visited in Kosovo, Prizren is, I thought, by far the place you ought to locate yourself.
Okay. And that had what looked like an old, possibly even a Roman bridge, and the mosque there with the minaret, with a little bit of the style of, I want to say, the Blue Mosque or Hagia Sophia, although just a much simpler, smaller local mosque.
A smaller version of it, yeah. And there was, once you got up on top of the fortress, where that fortress is, and you could see the entire city scattered with these minaret towers. In fact, that's a recommended thing. Climb that hill. It's actually a fairly short hike to go up to the fortress. It's one of the historical sites that I visited that there was absolutely no admission fee. There was nobody there. You just walked on in and enjoyed it. But to climb up there at or before sunrise and to watch the sunrise over the city, that's a fun travel experience.
And you mentioned that was your favorite city in Kosovo. Where else did you stay?
I went to Pristina, which is the capital of Kosovo. It's not a bad city. It didn't have the flavor that Prizren had. Prizren was a smaller city, but the people were easier to contact and to chat with. Now, one thing's interesting about Pristina that you may not expect, especially if you're an American wandering through there, is to walk into a square and see a 12-foot statue of Bill Clinton.
No, I don't think I've seen that many of those in my neighborhood. Okay.
And I guess Billy could only get a statue in Kosovo because he was a U.S. president at the time that the UN resolution was sponsored. They revere him as kind of a hero. And in both Pristina, in the capital, and in Prizren, they have a square named Bill Clinton Square. Bill Clinton.
Speaking of squares, and I let you get by without saying it before, but you were staying at one point, you mentioned, in Mother Teresa Square.
Yes. In fact, Mother Teresa is Albanian by birth. And because the ethnic population of Kosovo is predominantly Albanian, they also revere her as as a hero of Albanian culture.
Which is interesting because obviously she was not Islamic, but
No,
interesting.
yeah, but in Tirana, Albania, there's Mother Teresa Square. In Prizren, Kosovo, there's Mother Teresa Square. In Pristina, there's Mother Teresa Square. It's a predominant theme throughout the Albanian communities.
Hmm. What surprised you? I mean, we've named the surprising response you got already, but you've been spending some time around this trip in all the rest of the Balkans.
Yes.
So you think you know the region already, and then you get to Serbia, you get to Kosovo, and you had to rethink some things because of what?
There's definitely some cultural differences between them.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Slovenia and Croatia, they're very friendly people. They're very hospitable people, but they tend to be introverts. They tend not to smile on the street or make eye contact. It's almost as if they were Northern European, Scandinavian type of thing. They're very friendly and will help you, but they're not going to go out of their way to meet you.
Well, and that is a fairly European thing. I mean, the way that Americans are happy all the time. I know I was just hearing somebody who is from Paris describe that basically is in Paris, if you're happy, you must be stupid. It's kind of the cultural understanding.
It is. And why are you smiling at me?
Yeah. And so you sort of basically look like the village idiot, whether you're mean to or not, just because of the cultural difference. So it sounds like they have a little more of that.
Yes, they do.
Okay.
And both in Slovenia and Croatia had that kind of, I call it more introverted, because they are very friendly people. And once you get to know them, very hospitable, helping you out. But there is that initial wall or facade that takes a little time to bust through.
Okay. And then you were seeing here more of almost, I want to say, a Mediterranean personality.
Exactly. And so as soon as you got into Serbia and Kosovo, they tended to be much more open. You smile at them on the street. They'd be happy to see you. They'd start a conversation with you. I didn't know what to expect. That was a very pleasant surprise to have that happen.
It's funny because, of course, you haven't gone that far.
No, in fact, you cross what used to be the entire Yugoslav country, Yugoslavia, and then you see this ethnic diversity and culture diversity that was somehow sandwiched together for that period of time. And partly I understand why it probably broke apart.
Oh, yeah, it was always artificial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's interesting in that region, and I guess it's for smaller countries too, is that they're very nationalistic of their own small countries. And so you meet somebody who's living in Montenegro but is Serbian by nationality and birth, and they make it very clear to you that they are Serbian. They're not Montenegrin.
Right.
And then you meet somebody in Serbia from Montenegro, and they make it a point to tell you that they're Montenegrin, not Serbian. And linguistically, too, Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, they tend to be very interrelated because of their language. And yet, a Serbian will say that he does not speak Croatian, does not speak Montenegrin. Those are other distinct languages. And yet, when you're learning the basic phrases, they're really darn similar to one another.
Right.
Number one, I think for the Balkans, it's very easy to get around. Bus and air travel, very inexpensive to get around. Food pricing, you eat in an outdoor cafe in Belgrade, and you're probably with tip and your meal and your drink, maybe spending $6 to $8 for a restaurant meal.
And we talked about things to eat earlier on, but the one thing you didn't tell me is what was an Albanian dessert.
It's this frothy yogurt dessert.
Okay.
It looks like the kind of whipped yogurt, and it kind of has this frost on top, and they serve it in these. It almost looks like a Turkish hammered copper mug. As I sat in that cafe, people would stop by to get that dessert, and that's the only thing they were taking out of that cafe.
I know that when we had a Turkish exchange student live with us for most of a year, we bought a lot more yogurt that year than we normally do.
I bet you did. I mean, they eat it for breakfast. They have it sometimes at lunch, and they have it at dinner time as well.
Oh, yeah. A very important part in that diet.
And then fresh vegetables. I mean, tomatoes, carrots, and potatoes. That's all very common in this region. I had just enjoyed the food all over the place and didn't have any food problems at all.
Well, not just wonderfully tasty food, but wonderfully colorful food in my experience.
Yes. Yeah. And they take pride in the food.
Oh, yeah.
Something to try if you're in that region, if you've never tried it before. It's called, and I may mispronounce this, Ajvar, Ajvar. It's called the Serbian vegetable caviar. It's this mixture of it's red bell peppers with eggplant and garlic and chili powder that they mix all together in this kind of a thick sauce. And you can eat it with pita bread, or you can eat it on your meats,
Oh,
or
that sounds wonderful.
and it's really fantastic. In fact, I actually bought a big jar and brought it home with me because it was so tasty.
Excellent. What do you wish you had known?
One of the fun things is the surprises that came along.
Mm-hmm.
I probably would have spent more time in Niš and I known what was there. Kosovo, I probably would have stayed an extra time there to travel around to the different villages.
Mm-hmm.
This trip was a month long, and there just wasn't enough time to spend in each individual country. I'd go back to the region. It was that entertaining. There's not much literature on Kosovo. There's one Lonely Planet book. There's some internet blogs and those type of things about Kosovo.
Mm-hmm.
I misspoke. It's not the Lonely Planet. It's Brat, B-R-A-T-D-T.
Okay.
A very well-written book, but it's actually brand new. I don't think it's been out more than a year or two. But it's very well written and very detailed.
Excellent. You sent me a number of pictures that anybody who's been watching the enhanced version has been looking at. One picture that best captures this trip for you?
I think for Kosovo, it would be the picture that I took. There are two pictures. One is the top of the fortress looking down through Ren at sunrise, and the other picture was sunset looking at the city with the mosque and the fortress on top. Those are
and the snow-capped mountains in the background?
And snow-capped mountains. And, that was surprising, too. I didn't imagine, I didn't understand Kosovo's geography, and to see snow-capped mountains with these green hills was really a pretty sight.
And what time were you there?
I was there in May.
Okay, and that seems like probably a wonderful time to be there. I would think it gets fairly hot in the summertime.
Yes, in fact, their winters tend to be very hard. This last winter was extremely hard for Bosnia, Serbia. They had record snowfalls and had major problems. I think early fall and late spring would be ideal to travel in these regions.
Okay. And any other stories in terms of locals? You've mentioned a number of locals that you interacted with. Anybody who was the most memorable person you met?
Probably in Serbia, one of the memorable people, I was on a bus trip from Belgrade to Niš, and I sat next to a lady who had been a foreign exchange student in Kentucky, and so spoke English very well, was very excited that I was an American. And then across the aisle from me was a medical student whose father was a university professor, but he had been studying medicine in Prague. And they were very open about the bombing raids. This medical student had been in the Niš fruit and vegetable market when it was bombed by the UN forces. He thought it was American. I looked it up online. The internet referred to them as the Dutch fighters, but one of the bombs had strayed off and killed a bunch of people in the marketplace. He was very interested in telling me about Serbia, telling me about Serbians' history, how proud he was to be Serbian. And I think that was one of the fun surprises, is that this small country are very nationalistic, very proud of who they are and what they stand for. Another memorable person I met in Budva who was Serbian and was just working in Montenegro and was very concerned that the world perceived Serbians as criminals or warmongers, tending to relate all Serbians to the Milosevic era. And she was very concerned that the world had a negative perspective of who Serbians were. And instead, they were very happy, friendly people, and people ought to get to know Serbians better.
Okay.
And I think that's true. I think there's a perception that we hear the word Serbia, Bosnia.
Sure. There's still
Kosovo,
some lingering memories there, yeah.
Memories of war. And I think for the Serbian people, the ones that I talked to, and in fact, I asked them flat out, I don't hear any animosity. And they said, of course not. We like Americans, and we wish the world would visit us more often and get to know us. It was a positive aspect of that travel.
Excellent. I've got about 4 more questions for you as we go to wind this down.
Yes.
And some of these are typical questions, so you'll recognize these. When did you feel closest to home? When was it most familiar, and when was it least familiar?
I think closest to home is when I'm talking to the man at the airport who's visiting the United States, who speaks English very well, who understands American culture. That was closest to home, or the exchange student I was visiting on the bus. They were familiar with the U.S. culture. The furthest from home was probably sitting in the old town of Prizren, Kosovo. When the call to prayer is going off, all the Muslims are walking around and you're eating Turkish food. It sounds a little bit far away from my home.
One thing, and we'll give you 2 answers for this if you want, one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Serbia or only in Kosovo.
They tend to be dark hair.
Sure.
Not all Serbians, but they tend to be black hair. And I think it was interesting that some of the ladies would try to dye up their hair so they would look distinctly different. And the predominant color seems to be red. And I mean bright red.
Not a natural red.
Not a natural red. And
Okay.
just think it's like somebody took kind of a color swatch from Crayolas and said, I'd like that fiery red color on my hair.
Okay.
I guess what's funny is one of the ladies said that she was going to show me my way to the apartment. This was actually in Albania, and she described herself as, I would recognize her because she was about 5'6", black hair, wearing blue jeans and a white blouse. And I thought that just described about 95% of the women that I've seen.
That's funny. Before we get to our last two questions, do you have anything else that you think people should know before they go to this region?
I think just go.
Okay.
I venture out and go into the region. It's easy to get around, very walkable cities, easy to get around for transportation-wise. It's an inexpensive trip. I think it has that flavor of kind of a Turkish Eastern European mixture, but it's distinctly Serbian, distinctly Albanian, Kosovo.
Excellent. Well, you know the last two questions. Finish this sentence for me. You really know you're in Serbia, or you really know you're in Kosovo when what?
You really know you're in Kosovo when you see the American flag and the Kosovar flag displayed side by side without any distinction. Carnival rides had American flags on them.
Oh, funny.
It was just an interesting experience. And one thing we failed to mention is UN troops are still there.
No, you did mention that. Yeah.
You see all the different German and Turkish groups that are under the UN resolution, yet functioning independently of one another, or in concert with one another.
Right.
One thing that comes to mind in Serbia is it feels very European, especially you're sitting on a pedestrian street, eating a nice pizza, enjoying the sunny day. It just felt very European. And so if you enjoy the European culture, you'll enjoy Serbia.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize Serbia and if you had to summarize Kosovo in 3 words, what 3 words would you use? We'll give you 6 words here total.
Historic.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Open, friendly, culturally diverse, and nationalistic.
Now, it sounds like those 6 words apply to both places.
They do.
Okay.
In fact, both of those places would adopt all of those words and be uniquely themselves.
Not the same as each other, but okay. Interesting. Well, Shawn, thanks so much for coming back on The Amateur Traveler and for your new role as official Amateur Traveler Ambassador.
I didn't realize that we were so famous, Chris.
And thank you for sharing with us your trip to Serbia and your trip to Kosovo.
My pleasure. Love to travel.
In news of the community, I heard back from Elspeth, who was on the show, and I don't always read the emails that I get from the guests after they are on the show, but I often get something similar to what Elspeth said, is just plucked up the courage to listen to the podcast with the aid of a bottle of wine and really enjoyed it. My husband, who is particular about sound quality, generally thought your son had done an excellent job, so please pass on our thanks to him. I thought you had done great work with the photos, especially as I didn't help out much. I normally take 1,000+ photos on overseas trips, but rarely take a camera with me to the UK. It was particularly lovely to see the photos of my father, who sadly passed away this year. I'm sure my stepfather, who also makes an appearance, will also be delighted to see them. I was also impressed that you had managed to find photos of Beverly and even of Nellie's. And the reason why I bring that up is not just so much to pat myself on the back, but to thank Mike, my son, who has been doing the editing of the show, because he may have edited his last show. He's gone to work full-time, and when I say full-time, he's working in Hollywood a number of hours during the week and doesn't really have time to do the show anymore. We'll be passing off the editing to a friend of his. This week I managed to do all by myself, and to be honest, if I still had to do it by myself, I wouldn't be putting out the show anymore. And frankly, unless I can get some sponsorship to help pay for the expenses of some of the people who help out with the show, we may still not be able to do the show anymore, but that is still in the future. But thanks to Mike for the good job he did. He is the one who did both the audio editing and the image editing for the last 1.5 years, or 2 years maybe by this point. So thanks to Mike. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler, since I'm tired of putting the show together by myself this week. If you have any questions, feel free to send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com or leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @Chris2X or join the Facebook community, facebook.com/amateurtraveler. And as always, thanks so much for listening.